So I will just do a very brief introduction for all the attendees who've joined, and then Cristina, the stage will be yours. So hi everyone, thanks a lot for joining. So as you know, we've now restarted the NeuroAI Emerging Leader webinar series, and our first speaker after this relaunch is Professor Cristina Savin. She is an associate professor in neuroscience and data science at NYU. She was the recipient of the Google Faculty Research Award in 2020, and she has worked as a researcher at Cambridge University, ENS Paris, and IST Austria before joining NYU. Her group now uses tools from machine learning to study the principles of adaptive computation in brains and artificial agents by combining theory and statistical analysis of experimental data from many collaborators that they have. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Cristina. Please, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Hope this is going to be fun. So as you just said, I'm a computational neuroscientist, so my primary interest is in understanding principles of complex adaptive behavior. And this means both in terms of sort of like understanding the biological substrates in the brain that support learning, but also in trying to sort of like distill this to sufficiently abstract principles that can be then translated into the development of more flexible and robust artificial intelligence systems. Now, one key feature that brain computation has that maybe artificial systems don't yet is that it emerges gradually and compositional. So let's see. Sorry, I need to click slides. Okay, yes, that worked. Imagine that out of the blue, you are tasked to start juggling multiple balls while at the same time riding a unicycle. Now, unless you have already extensive circus experience, like you wouldn't from the get-go set out to achieve this goal. Instead, you'd work your way towards it. So you decompose this into subtasks, like riding a unicycle and juggling. If you already know how to ride a bicycle, you'd use the knowledge of how do you ride a bicycle to learn how to ride a unicycle. Similarly, in order to learn how to jog, you start with a single ball, then increase gradually the complexity until you get to the number of balls that you actually need to juggle. And only at the end of this process, when you've mastered each of the subtasks individually, would you attempt to put them together to actually achieve the final goal. Now, this kind of gradual path to mastery seems very intuitive to us humans. It is at the root of our educational system. It's also a key ingredient when training animals in neuroscience experiments. But it is not in general how artificial intelligence systems learn to do complicated things. So in our recent work, we've been arguing that there are lessons to be learned from this kind of gradual learning that can be transferred to like training artificial intelligence agents. Because I'm not going to have the time to go into all of the technical details, I'm going to just put the paper ad at the beginning of the talk for any details that haven't been covered. Have a look here. And this is work led by postdoc David Hawker in collaboration with one of our very excellent experimental collaborators at NYU, Cristina Constantinople. Okay, so we're going to start with a neuroscience experiment first. So it's not about benchmarks on our artificial intelligence task just yet, but we're going to focus on an experimental paradigm for value-based decision-making that's been developed in the lab of Cristina Constantinople at NYU. So how does this work? So briefly, the animal initiates a trial by a central poke. After that, a tone beep communicates to the animal a reward offer, which is one out of possible 5 options. Different frequencies correspond to different rewards. They know where the reward will arrive, so that there's a designated reward port, but they don't know when the reward will arrive. So the wait time until the reward delivery is drawn independently from an exponential distribution corresponding to a flat hazard rate. So at any moment in the trial, the animal has 2 options. It could either continue waiting until the reward is finally delivered, or if it decides that this is no longer worth its time, it can opt out by poking in the opposite port. At this point, the entire process gets reset and it starts all over again. Okay. An important nuance is that a small fraction of the time the experimentalist lies. So a reward is offered, but it's promised but never actually delivered. So this forces the animal to elicit the opt-out option, giving us an analog-rich behavioral readout in units of time of how much time is a particular reward offer worth the animal. Okay, so here's a video of an actual rat doing the task. So it initiated the trial. It got a beep that said that it's a 5 millisecond microliter offer. It went to the right port where the reward was promised. The reward didn't come. It went to the other port, started the entire thing again. On the right, it's exactly the same thing, but now the offer is 80. So you can see that it perseveres, it stays a little bit longer. And eventually, yeah, the reward is not coming and it's opting out yet again. So this is how's life of a rat in our experiment. You can think about the same kind of task from a more human perspective. So imagine you're trying to grab some breakfast coming into work. I know that there might be like different meals relevant for different segments of our audience today. And you go to your favorite place and you arrive there, but there's a big queue. So the question becomes, do I join this queue or do I look for other options elsewhere? Now, this choice might depend on how desperately you're craving for their breakfast burrito, which is the value of the current offer. It also depends on what are the other options available, what we call the opportunity cost. So if you're in a neighborhood where there are lots of good options available, you can just like go elsewhere and find a good meal. If you don't have that many good options, then you are more likely to join the queue and sort of like commit to the current option. Right, so the equivalent of different neighborhoods in our task comes in the form of blocks. So unknown to the animal, the statistics of the rewards available changes from like chunk to chunk. There are 3 block types, low, mixed, and high. And importantly, the middle option, the 20 microliter option, is available in all blocks. So it allows us to compare behavior depending on the statistics of the environment orthogonal to the reward magnitude per se. The block duration is random. It's about 40 successful trials, but the animals sometimes like disengage from the task, so that this can be quite variable in terms of total time duration. And the most important thing is the transition between the blocks is not explicitly signaled to the animals. So they need to like learn from trial by trial experience that the world has changed and maybe they want to adjust their strategy for how long they wait for individual reward offers. Okay, so first we can ask, okay, what would the best possible thing to do in the context of this task? And for that, we worked out a mathematical Markov decision process formalization of the task, which cheats a little bit in the sense that it knows a lot more about what's going on in the world than the animals, but kind of gives us an upper bound of what's the best possible achievable performance. And solving for this MDP gives us some sort of like key features that the good behavior should have in the context of this task. So first of all, there's this linear dependence between how much reward is being offered and how long you should be willing to wait, and what we call linear reward sensitivity. And the slope of this line tells us of how much an agent cares about the differences in the magnitude of the reward. The second important features is the context dependence. So if you're looking in the middle at the 20 microliter reward, an optimal agent waits substantially longer for the same like nominal reward when it's the best out of set of a bad options compared to when it's the worst of a set of good options. So the statistics of the environment should change optimal behavior. So this is what the math tells us that one should do in this task. This is an example, a rat actually doing the task. And it's not perfect, but sort of like there's a lot of qualitative features that are matched to this optimal behavior. More importantly, again, we have this context sensitivity. So the animals do actually wait longer in the low blocks. This is true for a single animal example, but also for the level of the entire cohort. So Christine has a large training facility where they can automatically train a large number of rats. We have hundreds of rats doing this task. And we use the how much less are you waiting in the high block versus a low block for the 20 microliter reward as a metric of context sensitivity, with the value smaller than 1 being like sensible behavior, and most of the rats behave sensibly. There are a few outliers there that never quite learn the task, but most of them do it in the sensible manner. Okay, so with a more detailed analysis of this behavior, we can show that the animals show signatures of model-based reinforcement learning. In particular, when we're looking at these transitions between blocks, the amount of time that they wait for the same 20 milliliter reward changes as a function of context. So they're waiting longer in the low block and less so in the high block. And there's a little bit of an asymmetry. If you sort of like look at the mixed to lower high transitions, that's a little bit more gradual than the low to high transitions. And the reason for that is that in the second kind of transition, you have these moments where you know for sure that the world has changed. So imagine that I'm in a low block, I'm only seeing 5, 10, or 20. Then the block transition happens, and just by luck, the few next trials, I still see the same kind of reward offers as I was seeing before, so still 20, 10. Like the world has changed, but there's no way for the agent to know that that's the case. But it's the first time when I'm seeing an out of distribution option. So when I'm seeing the 40, all of a sudden I know for sure, oh, the world has changed. Now I'm in a different kind of block, and I might want to start changing my strategy accordingly. Okay. So we can model this behavior as a form of online Bayesian inference where the animals maintain beliefs about what kind of block they are in, and trial by trial change these beliefs as a function of new evidence, so the rewards that they were getting in that particular trial. This is interesting, but also sort of like a challenging computational exercise because of the multi-scale nature of the task. So you need to do computation on very different time scales, and those need to be sort of like appropriately aligned. So first, on the time scale of a single trial, which is a few seconds, the animal needs to remember what the reward offer was, and it needs to like appropriately judge how long it's waited relative to what kind of block it is and what kind of offer it's gotten in order to engage in the opt-out behavior at the right time. On the trial by trial many seconds time scale, the animal needs to keep in mind what kind of block it thinks it's in, and it needs to do the belief updating of the context in order to adjust this policy appropriately. Okay, so although we understand from the perspective of the behavior what might be the computational ingredients involved, it's not at all clear how would you make a reinforcement learning agent or a recurrent neural network circuit that does this kind of computations. And this is the thing that we set out to do in our modeling work. Okay, so can we model this behavior in an artificial agent? So it turned out that it's actually pretty difficult. So what we did is we started constructing a deep reinforcement learning agent that tries to do exactly the same kind of task as the actual animals, with a couple of small caveats that end up being important. So first of all, in the case of the animals, the behavior is self-engaged. So they decide when they want to participate in doing this task. They initiate a trial by poking in the middle. We don't need to do that for the reinforcement learning agent. And the other technical caveat is that we can't have agents waiting forever, because then our training procedure breaks, and like you can't sort of like get new information. So we need to like enforce a sort of like an artificial maximal trial length in order for the optimization procedure to work at all. That seems like a small, like uninteresting kind of caveat, but it sort of like leads to agents that like slack their way through this world. So basically, you find agents that have neither offer sensitivity nor reward sensitivity, because they simply notice that if they do nothing, they just wait forever, reward will eventually come, and that gives you sort of like takes you to a local optimum that's like reasonable. And another sort of like salient but suboptimal local optimum is when more reward means you work harder. So they keep the agents keep track of the average reward available in the environment, and they wait longer when the world is promising more rewards in general, but without this sensitivity, which makes their behavior suboptimal. So we spent a number of months throwing all of the machine learning tricks that we knew at this problem, and failed to get in these trained reinforcement learning agents behavior that's either like close to optimal or similar to what the rats was doing. And it turned out sort of like the machine learning didn't have answers for us, but biology did. So we decided to like think more carefully about what enables the rats to learn this task. And the answer is gradual skill acquisition. So a key distinction between rats and our agents is that the recurrent neural networks are trained from scratch in the target task, whereas animals bring with them to the experiment a set of already acquired skills, like the ability to keep information in working memory, the ability to keep track of time. More generally, we all start by learning simple skills first, then we combine them to construct more complex abilities. So we decided to take our recurrent neural nets to kindergarten. Exactly how this works at the technical level is like we define a set of primitive subtasks, and we train the agents in a supervised fashion on like acquiring those skills. After that, we use behavioral shaping to like glue these little sub-elements or skills together to and work our way towards learning the actual target task. Okay, so the first question that you might ask is like, how do you know what are the primitive subtasks that make sense? In our case, we are a little bit fortunate in the sense that we have this Markov decision process ideal oracle that tells us roughly what are the computations minimally required in order to do this task. And this is the Q values associated with that agent. So this tells you what's the average value of weighting as a function of the state, which is defined by what reward was I offered in this trial and when in the trial am I? So how long have I waited already? And again, because we're cheating and sort of like we're giving this agent a lot of additional knowledge, we can write this down in closed form, and we can look at what are the mathematical ingredients of this solution. So one important element is that the solution needs to know about the reward offer, like trivial, and passage of time in units of sort of like what are the statistics of wait times in the environment. Finally, the agents need to know something about the typical reward structure of the environment. So that's what average rewards are you expecting to get given the current block context. Okay, so this gives us a few ideas about what are useful computations. We can engineer individual kindergarten tasks in order to make the agents good at stuff like that. So one task that we constructed is it's what we call the working memory task. Basically, the agent gets inputs with different values in an analog fashion, and it just needs to keep in memory the value of that input until the end of a trial. To encourage the agent to sort of like know stuff about the passage of time, we train a counting task where it needs to sort of like count 1 unit at a time relative to an event onset that's going to trial start. So you see a 1-bit on input, it goes from 0, goes up, the input like turns on again, then it resets and the counting starts again. And for stuff like how do you know about the statistics of things in the environment, we trained a couple of different strategies for doing that. So one of that is just like doing running averages of reward offers. So you get inputs and you just need to integrate them over really long time scales. It's what we call the integrate task. And the inference tasks encourages the agent to try to build beliefs about possible worlds that are compatible with different kind of sensory observations. So we're treating the agent to do discrete, like inference over discrete states. Okay, so after we've individually trained the agent with each of these tasks, then we essentially repeat exactly the training procedure that the rats undergo in Christine's experiment in their automated training procedure in the rat farm. The agent starts, and the rats start with no catch, mix block only kind of scenario where the reward always comes as promised and all of the options are in play. Then we introduce the catch probability. So sometimes the experimentalist lies. And finally, we go to the final task with the block structure and catch probability on. Okay. So again, this mimics one-to-one what the experimentalists do with the rats when getting them to behave in this experiment. Okay, so with all of these ingredients in place, we finally get agents that work. But before I'm going to tell you about the behavior of these agents, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the architecture. So this is kind of motivated both by biology, but also by sort of the computational ingredients required to solve the task. So we're going to have one inference module that's sort of it's pre-trained to know how to do like beliefs, like represent beliefs and update beliefs as a function of inputs. Then we're going to have the policy network that takes this information and maps it into values of states and a policy that tells you what's the probability of acting as a function of the current state. And both of these modules get offers information and motivated by an architecture called MetaRL developed by Jane Wang that's been used to sort of model cognitive flexibility in the prefrontal cortex. We also sort of like feed information about the past actions and rewards. So this allows an agent that doesn't change its parameters anymore to change its behavior as a function of like if it had a stable policy and the world changed, then the consequences of its actions change, and the fact that it directly gets the action and reward as inputs allows it to change its policy by any mismatch between what it was doing and what it was expecting to get. Okay, so each of these modules are fully coupled recurrent neural networks with individual elements being either LSTMs or GRUs, because we need like temporal credit assignment on really long temporal horizons, and we're training this by backprop through time. What makes the computation difficult is the sparse nature of the rewards in the really long temporal horizons. But this availability of the kindergarten tasks, which sort of like manifest in the form of additional output heads corresponding to the agent doing these tasks, is supposed to sort of like help us get to a stable solution. If you want to look at the actual loss function, this maybe gets too mathy, but what you have is you have the actor critic deep reinforcement learning standard loss function plus a regularizer that corresponds to the kindergarten task. So we use the kindergarten task both for pre-training and as auxiliary losses during the training of the final task. This like using it throughout is not strictly necessary, but it makes the solution more robust. So it's best to make sure that you're maintaining the old functions or the old skills that you've pre-trained throughout the training process. Okay, so this was the mathiest that we're gonna get. Let's look at some actual behavior. So finally, we get some recurrent neural networks that actually behave sensibly. So they start having both reward and context sensitivity. Because we have an explicit readout of what the beliefs of the animals are about the current state of the world, we can look at how they change their mind about the structure of the blocks at block transitions. And in the animals, we have a behavioral model that we fit to like observed behavior of rats that also generates predictions about what the rats' beliefs are from trial to trial as the block transition. And we're starting to see sort of like analogies at this kind of like trial by trial granularity. There's also sort of like nice similarity between the rats and the artificial agents in terms of like the time scales of how they learn, so how they gradually adapt their representations in order to improve their context sensitivity over the training process. Okay, so this is good. We finally have achieved the goal of making some agents that make sense. You can ask, okay, was all of this trouble actually worth it? So what were we gaining by this complex training procedure? So to answer this, we're first going to compare three classes of training procedures. So in gray, we have what we call our full kindergarten that I've just described. In orange, we have shaping only, where we're doing the same kind of training procedure that the rats undergone, but starting from scratch from a completely unstructured RNN. And finally, the train in red, we have the no curriculum learning at all. We're just like brute force training in the target task for very long horizons. And because our reviewers were very kind to us, they asked us to like show that if you did it a little bit longer, like you wouldn't be able to find a good solution. So we ended up training these alternative agents for like ridiculous amounts of time. And the punchline is that basically you converge to poorer optima, and it takes a lot longer to train. So this ability to do appropriate kindergarten pre-training speeds up training time by orders of magnitude, and it also leads to like task solutions that are much better than the alternatives and close to optimal. Okay, so you can ask, okay, did I have to do all of the kindergarten tasks? Could I do only one at a time or only a combination? And we can look at sort of like what happens if you do a kindergarten training procedure where you only pre-train the agent to do inference, so to represent the context, which seems like the hardest bit of skill to learn a priori before starting the task. And that on its own is not enough. So it's not enough to give you the full kindergarten functional benefits. What's kind of interesting is training only for working memory gets you to pretty good places and relatively fast, which is possibly a reflection of the fact that what's hard about the reinforcement learning task to begin with, one important aspect of it is the very long horizon temporal credit assignment. So having like circuits with good working memory can help with sparse rewards and long temporal horizon tasks, pretty much irrespective of the other details. if you look at sort of like the nuances of the behavior, so the context sensitivity, the offer sensitivity, and the opt-out rate, so how frequently is the agent choosing to like terminate the trial early, regardless of whether it was a catch trial or not. We start to see nuances even in between agents that sort of like have similar reward rates. So in particular, if you remember, the black was the full kindergarten and the green was the memory only kindergarten. Those have like comparable rates of reward. So like from the machine learning perspective, they seem to be doing equally well. But in terms of the nuances of exactly how they solve the task and what's their observed behavior, they look subtly different in the sense that full kindergarten has stronger context sensitivity than the working memory only curriculum. And the full kindergarten is more rat-like than the working memory curriculum. So this kind of points that there might not be sort of like a unique solution to this task, and different experiences of training might lead to different computational strategies to training these agents. Okay. Because again, our reviewers are very nice. They asked us, did you have to do all of this? Could you have done X, Y, Z, and other letters? So I'll show you a few of the, could you have done it differently? Would it have led to something similar numerical experiments that we've tried? So the actual nature of the kindergarten tasks matter. So we try to pick some tasks that have similar computational difficulty, but they're not helpful for the target task. Like one of these being sort of like delayed match to non-sampling. Anyways, there's some sort of like similar complexity tasks that we train animals to do in working memory experiments. And those don't help as much. So although it has a working memory component, so it's sort of like it's supposed to help you keep information in memory to some extent, it's not quite the same thing. And again, adding more tasks on top of each other that are relevant for the target tasks improves performance. We also try to use the tasks only as auxiliary variables during the regularization, so during the behavioral shaping. That helped a bit, but not quite the full extent. So pre-training is important. We also try to sort of like keep the essence of the computation, but change the domain of the computation a little bit. So like pre-training a context inference model that does inference on a much bigger set of possible contexts. And the mismatch like came with a little bit of a penalty, but you still got the benefits. So this suggests that maybe in general, it like as long as you get the essence of the task right, like the details don't have to be strictly matched to the target procedure in order to see a positive effect. Okay, so a quick interim summary. What we have proposed is something that we call kindergarten curriculum learning, where the idea is to train simple tasks with supervised objectives as a way of initializing deep reinforcement learning agents and enable them to learn complex tasks. The right kind of pre-training is really defined by the compositional structure of the target task, and something that I didn't mention but is kind of important. If you think about sort of like analogies on like how we do traditionally curriculum learning or hierarchical reinforcement learning, typically you think about the decompositions that's sequential. So like the target task is I have to do A first, then B, then C, and then you train A, B, C individually, and in the target task you learn how to stitch them together. Here we're training sub-computational motifs that need to be computed in parallel and then combined in order to generate the final structure. So you don't have this sequential element attached to the composition. The target training benefits from having the task not only in pre-training phase, but also as auxiliary objective. And if you sort of like think about how would you translate this approach to other tasks, you need to have some understanding about what the computational sub-elements involved are. And in our case, what really helped to identify those subcomponents was having this approximate Markov decision process description of the task, where you could sort of like break it down explicitly in what kind of variables do you need to compute. Like, it's not strictly necessary, like you might rely on intuitions, but if you have such an approximate description of the mathematics of the task, that can be very instructive about how to go about designing a good kindergarten curriculum. Okay, so that's kind of the machine learning aspect of the story. There's a more neuroscience aspect of the story that asks, okay, what exactly is going on? Like, what did we do to these modules of the deep reinforcement learning agent in order to enable this computation? And in order to sort of like be able to sort of like do a comparison with the actual brain activity in the rats, we developed a statistical analysis procedure that tried to sort of like reverse engineer what's going on in the circuit as the agents are computing this task, either the animals or the actual RNNs. And that kind of sort of like goes directly at the essence of what's special about this task, which is the fact that you need to do computation on very different time scales. The within trial computation for like deciding when to opt out, and the cross trial computation for keeping track of the context and adjusting the behavioral strategy accordingly. So we made a hierarchical latent state space model that you can fit to like neural data. So this is either recordings from the rat brain or the actual activity of the RNN while doing this behavior. And that tries to sort of like split apart fluctuations that like change systematically from trial to trial from fluctuations within the trial. So that allows us to factor out fast versus slow inferences on population dynamics. If you do this in the RNN, you find interesting things. So at the level of the slow dynamics, we find changes in activity that reflect the context. So the latent variables have very different values when you're finding yourself in a low, a mixed, or a high block, with a small reward sensitivity that sort of like almost mimics what you're seeing at the level of the behavior. And we can also sort of like look at the block transition. So these latent variables smoothly transition at a time when the world has changed. The fast latents, on the other hand, encode the reward offer, which is what you need to do to make the within trial decisions. If you do exactly the same procedure now to neural activity in the rat brain, we find like pretty tight analogies. It's not perfect, but the same kind of signatures emerge in the brain activity, suggesting that maybe the computational mechanism that we've developed in the context of the deep reinforcement learning agents does actually share mechanistic similarities with what's going on in the brain. Okay, like this is as much as we can go with respect to actually looking in the brain for now, but with the recurrent neural networks, we have like perfect access to them, so we can look in more detail about exactly what they're doing and what they have learned. I'll skip this because we're running a little bit late. But what's like really a simple way of looking at what's going on during the learning process is to ask, okay, how much have the parameters of these networks changed as a function of the training procedure? And what you see is, because the networks are initialized from like completely random conditions, a very common observation is you're going to see like really big changes at the beginning of the learning process, and then the rest is where it's like I'm starting from nowhere. I need to get myself closer to the solution space of the task. But after that, like the refinements are relatively small in magnitude, and this you see in the very early kindergarten training. Sorry, I can't see my mouse. That would have been helpful in this particular instance. So the easy, hard, like very beginning part. But what's kind of interesting it was interesting for us that you see even more massive reorganization of the representation when you start to introduce the harder kindergarten tasks, in particular during inference. And that's true in both the inference and the policy submodule. So once the kindergarten has trained, the actual training within the task, so the pre-shaping and the final, that looks like refinement. So the changes in the parameter are relatively small compared to what was happening during the curriculum training. So this kind of like tells us that there's an important organization of the internal representation of these modules that enable learning within the task. And because the long temporal timescales are kind of a mission critical element of the task of interest, we can hypothesize that what's really important is developing attractor dynamics or some sort of like slow modes in the dynamics that support slow computation. To measure this more directly, we brute force analyze the dynamical system structure of the agents at different like stages of the learning process and asked what's the number of slow dynamical systems features that we can find in the network as the learning progresses. And what's really remarkable here is that you start with like trivial one or two attractors. That's kind of a property of the initialization. But over the learning process, especially during the inference big reorganization of the circuit, what you're doing is building more and more slow dynamical systems features into the system. And then when you go into the actual task, you're kind of like figuring out which of those dynamical systems features are useful, and you keep them, and then pruning down some of the irrelevant stuff. So like the number of fixed points goes down, but you're still keeping enough of them to actually be able to solve the desired computation. So what we can say here is that the inference stage in particular seems critical for building like rich dynamical systems features into the network that then can be potentially exploited during the training in the task. Another sort of like complementary piece of evidence, if you try to do exactly the same kind of analysis for other curricula. In particular, remember that the working memory green curriculum had functionally equivalent like reward rates, so it was doing equally well, but with different kind of behavioral signatures. So what you can find is like the other curricula don't do that. So like first of all, they don't build that many features in the first place. And second, the final solution has fewer fixed points or slow dynamical systems features than the full kindergarten curriculum. So it looks at the mechanistic level, the different training procedures like push you towards like qualitatively different ways of solving the problem. That's particularly true in the inference submodule, but is also true in the policy layer on the right. Okay, so can we understand what's going on even further? Can we understand what about these dynamical systems features actually support the computation? So it turns out that the dynamical system structure is a little bit high dimensional. So like projecting it in 2 dimensions to actually understand stuff is not trivial, but we managed to do it to some extent. And there's something to be understood as a result of this process. So if you haven't seen one of these before, so these are the first 2 principal axes of response variability in one of the modules. And the color code here is the kinetic energy of the system. So it's like how, given like if you're in this particular point in the state space, how fast are you moving away from it after one step of running the recurrent dynamics? And what you can show is like this more directly in terms of like not only how fast you're going, but in which directions you're going. So if you've actually seen this sort of things before, the way you read out this information is that there are a few regions in the space where the flow is very low, and the arrows are pointing towards it. And those are attracting slow features of the dynamic. So in this particular case, we have like two fixed points, the black dots, and something that appears to be like a line attractor, where you're going towards the line, but along the line you can still move as a function of different inputs. Okay, okay, we have three features. We also have like three possible contexts. Maybe this helps in some way to maintain information about which kind of block you're in. In order to know this, we can overlay on exactly the same picture. What does the agent think the context is as a function of where in the state space you are? And again, because we have an explicit readout of the belief from this network, so like each point corresponds to an interpretation of what do I think is going on in the world. So if you do that, what you find is that these like slow features like nicely overlap with regions of belief of being in either the high, the mixed, or the low block. Now, I'm showing you a different network for two purposes, both to show that sort of like this kind of phenomenology is kind of consistent. So we see this across different networks. This is a GRU network. The other one was an STM network. They behave functionally equivalently. The GRUs look a little bit prettier with respect to these flow fields. So I'm gonna like do the rest of the explanation in a GRU network. But we see the same kind of thing. There are like three slow features that in this case, there are three fixed points. And they lie in regions of the space that correspond to beliefs about being a low, mixed, or high block. Now we're looking at sort of like the average trajectory in trials where you're in different kind of blocks, but the offer in this particular trial is the middle one, so the 20 milliliters. And there's an initial transient that's a little bit off. I thought that the dynamics are more than two-dimensional, so that they go a little bit against the arrows because they're actually going outside of the plane. But the important point is, where do you end up at the end of the trial? So a 20 milliliter reward is compatible with all possible scenarios because I can get 20 milliliters in either a high or a mixed or a low block. So this trial should not change my opinion in any way about the true state of the world. Like, it doesn't give you information about the world changing. And this is exactly what you're seeing in the trajectory. So if I started believing that I was in a low block in the blue trace, I'm still in a blue region at the end of the process, etc. And because I'm along this line of slow dynamics, that allows me to keep my opinion over the time scale required to transition into the next trial. So the slowness is the maintaining information for long time scales, and the parallel lines that are kind of orthogonal with the decision axis is a reflection that this didn't provide me any information, so I should not be actually changing my beliefs. Now, a different scenario is that now I'm in a mixed block, but I get different kind of reward options. So a single piece of information in this context should not completely change my mind, but it should move my beliefs a little bit, either towards high or towards low block. So if I have big rewards, which are the dark lines, I'm shifting closer to believing that the world has suddenly improved. If I have a small rewards, I'm shifting to the left towards sort of like more strongly believing that perhaps I'm approaching a low block. So this is a long way to say that at the level of the dynamical system structure of these networks, we actually can understand the mechanics of belief updating to some degree, and they're kind of sensible. Okay, the other interesting observation, if you go through exactly the same exercise in the networks pre-trained with the other curriculum, so the working memory only networks that were doing well but have like weak context sensitivity, their dynamical system structure is qualitatively very different. So not only they have fewer fixed points, the way they do the computation is fundamentally different and not that easy to understand because it just like purely relies on slow transients. So this again sort of like reinforces the notion that there might be like multiple qualitatively different ways of computing what's needed for this task, but also sort of like points to hope that we might be able to understand across animal variability as sort of like different qualitative solutions in how they're solving the task. Okay, I am again running late, but I'll just do a very quick one to say that we can do the same kind of exercise in the policy network. And there, although you only have one single fixed point, you have like transients with different speeds that lead you towards the decision to opt out. And that means that different rewards put you at different initial conditions, and that determines how long you're going to be willing to wait. So that means that within trial computation can also be understood from the lens of this dynamical system structure. Beliefs about different blocks come as inputs to the system, and that shifts the location of the fixed point. So that systematically shifts how long you're going to wait until you opt out as a function of what kind of block you're in. Which completely recapitulates what we're seeing at the level of the behavior. Very last bit of numerical results, and then I'm going to break for questions, is that we had like two pieces of information. First of all, we understand how the final solution is being constructed at the level of the dynamical systems, like elements of computation. And second, we saw that there's a lot of dynamical system structure being built in the kindergarten curriculum part of the training that like we hypothesized might be useful for the later in task computation. So can you see that more directly? So you can like try to, maybe not the flow fields because those are kind of like difficult to generate over the training process, but you can look at the average trajectories that we were looking at before and see back in time during the training process what happens with the activity of the network. So now we're going to do 3 PCs because like there's variability in the third axis that's kind of important. So this is at the end of training. So we're seeing different rewards like leading to different trajectories that lead to different waiting times. Now, if I'm looking exactly at the same network earlier in the training process, I find a similar kind of coding of the rewards, but with the axis slightly rotated. I can go further back in time and find the same kind of dynamical system structure rotated even further. So this kind of like suggests that there's a little bit of a recycling of dynamical systems motifs with restructuring that's potentially largely geometric in this case. Now, if you look at the inference module and look at the encoding of block, this is at the end of training, this is at the end of inference. So here is even more sharply clear that whatever dynamical system structure you built during the kindergarten procedure is essentially recycled for the final task including the geometric details. And we can make like little videos about sort of like looking at here are the slow points of the network and how they change over the learning process, and see that you're essentially just massaging a little bit essentially the same dynamical system structure. Which kind of suggests that once you have these dynamical systems features that are useful, you can reuse them and reshape them in order to develop new functionality in the target task. Okay, so that's it. Let's do a quick summary, and then I'm gonna hopefully have some time for questions. So what we're seeing from a mechanistic perspective is this process of representing and updating beliefs via slow points of recurrent dynamics. And like from the neuroscience perspective, the computational building blocks of cognition, since we're going back to the title, is really about the creation and reshaping of dynamical systems features across different stages of experience. An important learning rule when trying to use like artificial intelligence agents in order to try to explain animal behavior or neural activity is that the brain is not tabula rasa, so whatever experimentally induced learning happens on an already structured system, and sort of like the behavioral shaping and whatever the experience the animal had before the experiment might change the computational strategies adopted to solve tasks, specifically complex tasks, which is important because like we've had a lot of success trying to like use trained reinforcement learning or sort of like RNN agents as a way of explaining structure in the brain. But I think we were kind of lucky by virtue of using very easy tasks. So when you go to more complex cognitive tasks, the training from scratch on the target, it doesn't no longer like explains the phenomenology in the brain or in the behavior. Okay, so with that, I'll thank you for your attention. This is my lab. I should acknowledge David Hocker, who's led this work, and our wonderful experimental collaborators, Christine Konstantinopoulos' lab, in particular Andrew Ma and Shannon Schrick, who've been developing the behavior modeling of the rats, and Shannon has been doing all of the neural recordings that we were analyzing. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Christina. It was a great talk. I would say personally, like it just triggered so much in my mind, like with all the research that I've also done, like, we've also done some comparisons between RL and actual biological neurons and all that, and the everlasting question of how do biological, units do that actually. Thank you so much. It was amazing. Um, so first, okay, yes, we have a question in the chat. So maybe I
I,
will.
for some reason, can't see the chat at the moment, so you're gonna have to read
Oh,
it
okay,
from.
yeah, I'll just read it aloud. And just to the audience, anyone else who has a question, either you can just raise your hand, or after we're done with this question, just unmute yourselves. So the question is, it seems counterintuitive that number of attractors would decrease during the catch trials. How are catch trials represented in the PC1, PC2 plots, the 2D embedding site?
There are like two interesting questions in that space. So it seems counterintuitive to make dynamical system structure only to like get rid of it later in the training process. We've seen that in other contexts as well. So there's previous work we've done on metadynamics. We're just looking at what kind of dynamical system structure do you construct in order to solve tasks, and how does that change over the learning process when learning single tasks. And depending on the optimization procedure or the learning algorithm, there are some, especially the more biologically realistic ones, where you see this phenomenology a lot. So you see overexpression of dynamical systems features in early stages of the training process, and then the pruning of those for the final solution. We don't have like a general theory of when should that happen and when that's not necessary, but it's not the only place where we've seen that. With respect to like what in the representation changes at the point where we are introducing the catch trials, I don't know, but that's a very interesting question. We kind of assumed that like the agents don't really change their policy much when you introduce experimental lies into the process, but we haven't quantified that explicitly, so it would be like interesting to check.
Yeah. I was just thinking off the top of my head about the first point as well. I don't know, maybe if you think about even human babies, like when they're trying to learn, like at earlier stages, they would go explore more, probably kind of
Yeah,
try
like
to
motor babbling and things like that. Yeah.
expand their arsenal of how they can handle this, how they can pick up an object of different shapes. But then as time goes on, they can learn to specialize to certain tasks and just probably use a subset of all those explorations that they've done before. So yeah, there
Yeah.
could be some similarities there.
That's also my intuition. Again, we don't have like a mathematically precise justification of why it happens,
Yeah,
but it's sort of like going back to the question of what would make a good kindergarten curriculum. And I would argue that kindergarten curricula that make rich dynamical system structure into the system that then you can tap into and like reshape in order to do the final task would be a good thing. And a
yeah,
bad curriculum learning training procedure would be a procedure that kind of like very early in the training process, like collapses the set of possibilities to a too small subset.
yeah,
So I think having options and having like a rich repertoire of dynamical system structure is kind of the name of the game in how do you construct good curriculum.
yeah, makes sense. Are there any other questions from the audience, from the attendees? Anyone who would like to just unmute themselves or type in the chat?
If there is, maybe I can ask one question. It was amazing presentation, Christina. I really enjoyed it. And I have many, many questions, but in virtue of time, maybe I can ask a few for now.
Go
But
for it.
for sure, we can continue later. And yeah, I'm very interested to ask some questions. One question is that we know that rats exhibit individual variability. So
Mhm.
can kindergarten CL, the curriculum learning trained networks, be tuned to reproduce a specific subpopulations of behaviors?
That's an ongoing project that I don't have like good final answers to, but it's something that we're trying on right now. We were very excited about sort of like seeing like qualitatively different computational strategies emerging in the agents that don't have like super obvious behavioral signature. So it's pretty subtle and statistical rather than I can totally tell from the outset based on the weighting, like average weighting behavior, whether I'm one or the other type. So that kind of would imply that maybe some of the across subject variability that we're seeing can be only resolved at the neural level. So like if we're looking at the activity of the brain circuits implementing this function, and we're seeing like qualitatively different kind of dynamical system structure there that might help like pull animals into like different kind of cognitive strategies. We've also tried to do a little bit of clustering of the, because we have like over 300 rats like recorded behaviorally at this point. We only have a few tens of rats where we have neural activity. Yeah, so there's some degree of clustering based on their behavior as well, but we don't know if that clustering matches with the computational strategies that we're segregating in the deep reinforcement learning agent. So that's still work in progress. I'm hoping that they will come together. That would be very nice, but time will tell.
Yeah, for sure. So one more question is if there isn't anything from audience. Yeah, but one is in scenarios that we have open-ended environments where when no tractable MDP solutions exist, is there a principled way to design subtasks?
Yeah, that's like we have anecdotes rather than that this is how you should engineer your curriculum kind of answers to this. As I said, like our MDP is like cheating by a large margin. So like it's not solving the actual task, it's assuming that somebody tells you exactly in what block you're at. So like all of the inferential and the difficult bits of the problem have been solved for you and you're only doing pretty dumb things. But even with this kind of like extremely coarse approximation description of the task, you still can get some insight into the kindergarten curriculum that might be helpful. So I would say like don't completely abandon the I can squint at this hard enough to make math out of it. But in the absence of that, I think there are like two take-home messages. First of all, pre-training tasks that especially when you're sort of like in a scenario with what makes the training difficult is the fact that you have sparse rewards and really long temporal horizons. Working memory tasks and building a lot of dynamical system structure are good ideas.
Mhm.
So I would try like pre-training with tasks that are known to like push the working memory capacity. The other thing that we've done, not in the context of this task, but in the context of some other like training procedures, is like you can gradually increase the working memory capacity. So start with relatively short working memory that's kind of like you can brute force train from backprop, and gradually, once you have that trained, gradually increase the depth. So those things work really, really well, and sort of like it can solve a lot of a lot of problems if this is the nature of what makes the target task difficult to learn. And yes, I was talking with one of my machine learning collaborators the other day, and basically I think sort of like there is this sentiment in curriculum learning that what makes bad curricula is that it sort of like concentrates the representation on too narrow hypothesis spaces, and basically that you're making life more difficult for yourself, because then you sort of like you're not exploring enough other options. Whatever curriculum that keeps the hypothesis space relatively large and potentially builds interesting dynamical system structure into it, if the agent it's a dynamical system recurrent one, should be good things. So it's like maybe you can't, I can't tell you what the curriculum is, but post hoc, if you train on a curriculum, I can tell you why this curriculum didn't do so well by virtue of like it concentrated the representation too much, or sort of like it didn't really build much dynamical system structure.
I
Just like
see.
a not completely satisfactory answer, but at least part of a solution.
No, good. And one last question, I promise to be quiet after that. Out of curiosity, what happens if the order of subtask is reversed? For example, the harder ones come first and then the simpler ones.
We've done that. As I said, our reviewers had a lot of questions. We originally didn't want to do all the combinatorial set of all possible options because it seemed like a lot, but we ended up doing almost that. So the order does matter. You like the general recipe is like you start easy and we do the harder stuff later. That's the best. Like I think the differences are not like there's somewhere in the 20-something pages of supplementary of the paper, but I think the differences are not huge, but in the space of possible sequences, you want to start early and do the harder stuff later.
I see.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I will read the paper in detail. But thanks for your answers.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cristina. I will just have one last question. I promise this is an easy one because I think you might have mentioned it. I just want to clarify I've understood it correctly. So just very quickly about your kindergarten training phase. So with the 4 different tasks like memory, counting, and all that, I didn't catch that exactly. Are you doing these sequentially, those 4?
Yes.
Yeah?
So the way this works is like you do a task. Once the task has reached criterion of training, it becomes an auxiliary task for everything that you train later.
Yeah.
So you sort of like you intermittently like train on the other things.
Yeah.
But
Makes sense.
I think at that point we were just like trying to be extra thorough. It's not 100% clear that you needed to put quite so much effort. At least annealing out of the auxiliary curriculum seemed to do okay.
Makes sense. Okay, thank you so much. I imagine, some of the audience also had to leave probably because we're over time. So I guess there are no more questions. Thank you so much, Cristina. It was really fun.
Thank you all.
Amazing
If anybody has questions that they want to hear more complicated answers after, just drop me an email.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much. And the recording will be available online as well, just in case. So it was amazing meeting you. Thanks for your time, Cristina.
Thank you all. Bye.
Have a good day.